All right, guys, welcome back to Wide Awake News Radio. Charlie McGrath on the 6th day of March, Wednesday. Joining me now is one of my favorite writers, Ellen Brown. Her website is webofdebt.com. If you haven't been there and checked out her work, please go there. You can also pick up her book, webofdebt.com. It's been a while since we've had Ellen on, and the last time that you were on, Ellen, I think we were talking about community banks or something along those lines. Certainly, we were covering the topic of this less than fair system that we have right now that is all about rescuing a few institutions and not the people. How have you been? Thanks for coming back on.
Thanks for having me.
How have you been?
Good.
All right, then.
Good enough.
Good night. Thanks for coming on. And if you're not watching, if you're not in one of the 80 or so we have in chat, you can go to wideawakenews.com, click on the microphone, get into chat. If you want to watch Ellen and myself do this thing live here, you can access the Justin TV feed from there. We're both streaming live video. Ellen, you sent me an article that you wrote earlier today, and I kind of want to get into this. The title of it is QE for the People, Grillo's Populist Plan for Italy. What is going on with Italy? A lot of people, you know, and I should have prefaced this with, obviously we're being treated with battles in Washington, D.C. about sequester. And right now we have Rand Paul filibustering Brennan's nomination. The eyes of the debt crisis have certainly not been, or I should say the focus of the debt crisis has certainly not been in the mainstream. What is going on with Italy and what is going on with the European debt crisis?
Well, Italy is heavily in debt, and what I just wrote about was Grillo, the comedian whose party swept the elections to the surprise even of Grillo himself. And so now they have to listen to him. It's not that they won. There's no majority, but in order to, they'll have to have a coalition government, and they'll have to join with Grillo's party, and Grillo's party is not backing down, and they're basically the party of no, or Grillo organized an event, a V-Day, annual V-Day, where the V stood for F word off. So they're opposed to everything. They're opposed to the current politicians who are all corrupt, and to every form of international agreement, to the euro. They're opposed to all that. But they're not totally negative. So that's what I was writing about, what their positive platforms are. And their positive platforms are actually very good, I think. I think they would work. One is to walk away from the debt, which they certainly should. At the interest rates that they're having to pay, as Grillo points out, it's not because the government is spending too much. In fact, the government spends less than they take in taxes. So they're very frugal, really. But because of this huge debt that they have and the interest that they're paying on the debt, which is all the result of speculators jacking up the interest rate, they can't meet their budget, and they keep getting downgraded. And so it's a debt that is imposed from abroad, or the increase in the debt, the exponential rise in the debt is because of this whole banking system that they could get out of by simply walking away from the debt, as Iceland did, Argentina did, Ecuador did, Russia did. I mean, many countries have done it very successfully. And then what they would need to do is set up their own internal currency, go back to the lira, no doubt. That was one platform. Another was to have a guaranteed income, basic income guarantee, which of €1,000 a month. So everybody would get basically Social Security of all ages. And this is actually, again, this is not the off-the-wall proposal that it sounds like. It's actually necessary, according to Social Credit, which is a money reform group or theory that goes back to the 1920s, which based on the work of C.H. Douglas, who actually made a lot of traction at that time. In the 1930s, money reform was all the rage in the 1930s. Everybody knew about it. People talked about it all the time, unlike today when they really don't know anything about where our money comes from or what they know there's something wrong with the banking system, but they really don't know what. But in the 30s, they were much more savvy. And the social creditors said...
Wait, let me ask you, were they much more savvy globally, or are you talking in Italy or Europe specifically?
I think globally. We had like 2,000 groups that were trying to do monetary reform, proposals for monetary reform in the U.S. And then in New Zealand, they actually had a social credit government. In Alberta, Canada, they had a social credit government. C.H. Douglas spoke in Japan, and the Japanese really went for it. And according to C.H. Douglas said they stole his ideas, but what they did in the 1930s was to just issue credit and support their industries with it. That wasn't exactly what Douglas had in mind. He was thinking of something more local. But the Japanese, in this way, managed to run circles around everyone else in the 30s, except for Germany, which was doing the same thing, and Italy, which is doing the same thing. They were all issuing their own credit. And that's basically what social credit is, that the government should be issuing credit because there's simply not enough money competing for the goods and services on the market. There can't be. There never is enough because the manufacturers set their price to cover all their costs, including their workers, their materials, their profits, the interest on the debt, et cetera, the things they borrow. And all that money doesn't get recycled back into purchasing the products. A lot of it gets saved. That's a major problem, or reinvested. Certainly the bankers aren't out there spending all their money on consumer goods and services. So to make up for the gap, you need to get some money out there, and the natural way to do it is to have the government in some way or other drop it into the pockets of the people. And a monthly dividend is a nice way to do it.
Sure. And
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, this idea of an expanding monetary base or expanding monetary supply, you've come on here and talked about this before. You and I have talked about this before as being necessary for the reasons that you just stated, because a dollar spent doesn't necessarily mean that dollar's turned around and put right back into the economy. But we tend to be taught, right, that anybody that talks this line is anti-capitalism, or they're anti-American way, and we call it welfare, we call it handouts. But the ironic thing is, we're doing it right now. I mean, aren't we? We are using the Federal Reserve to buy all this debt. It isn't going into the pockets of the people. The only thing it's doing is keeping the value of stock and these too big to fail institutions from going belly up. So we're told on one hand that it's evil and it's welfare and it's socialism and this, that, and the other thing, but we're doing the exact same thing. We're just not doing it for the people of the country. We're doing it for the elite.
Exactly. And that, in fact, that's what Roosevelt did in the 1930s. He took Hoover's bank, the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, that Hoover was using to bail out the banks. That's all he was using it for, was to bail out the banks. And the theory was that then the banks would make loans and bail out the businesses. But that's not what happened, just as it hasn't happened today. And so then Roosevelt took that over, and he used that same engine to recycle all the savings of the country, basically, and to put it back into building infrastructure, putting people to work. He actually used it for productive endeavors. And over a period of, I think, 15 years, it was the largest bank in the world, although it wasn't even technically a bank. And it had turned a profit for the government. And meanwhile, it had done all these things. It funded World War II, and it built all these roads, bridges, dams, libraries, post offices, all the things that we take for granted today, universities. And they were all built with money from this just credit engine of the government.
And now when we do this, now when we have any kind of a build out or infrastructure build out, it isn't like it was then, is it? I mean, now we have special interest written legislation, $1 trillion stimulus, and nowhere near the return for the people. This money's spent, but in a lot of ways, it ends up in the pockets of the special interest to help write the legislation. Don't answer that, because we're going to go into break right now. We're going to be back with Ellen Brown and more Wide Awake News Radio in just a second. You can answer on the backside of the break. We'll be right back. All right, guys, welcome back to Wide Awake News Radio. Charlie McGrath, joined by the Ellen Brown. Her website is webofdebt.com. You can see her latest articles there. I'm confused, though. I know you Seeking Alpha, your stuff's there, and some of your stuff, you're waiting on this article to be picked up at Truth Out, right?
Yeah.
Do you just independently write for all these outfits, or are they just picking up your material?
I just write. Anybody who's interested in picking it up, it's okay by me.
Okay, well, we got that squared away. I see your work everywhere, I guess is the point, and why wouldn't I? It's usually very factual and it drives a good point home most times, so I'm sure most of these alternative media sites for sure picking it up. I was talking before the break about how, this C.H. Douglas, his theories would now be, if C.H. Douglas came out and spoke at a university or anywhere right now in America, he would be called a socialist, a communist, the anti-capitalist. But it is what we're doing right now. I mean, in one way, we are having government bailout, doing quantitative easing. It just isn't to the people. It is to special interest, banking interest, correct? And you're about to answer that, and I cut you off.
Yeah. Well, I totally agree. And quantitative easing, I mean, what's interesting is they're actually doing it. So nobody can say you can't do that because it'll be inflationary. We can point to that and say we're still in deflation. We've still got housing way down, wages are way down. So overall, the price level is way down. And how can that be if they're pumping so much money into the economy? Of course, the answer is that the money's not really getting into the economy. That's one answer. But if it were getting into the economy, it would still not create inflation, as was demonstrated in, for example, New Zealand, when they had a social credit government, which funded this big public housing project just by issuing the money and paying for the workers and materials and building these low-cost housing. And it did not inflate did not inflate prices. And they wound up with this great asset that they didn't have before, a producing asset for the government, paid rent to the government without inflating prices. And there are other examples. In Guernsey, the island state of Guernsey has been printing money since 1820 or so to build. They were in desperate straits, and they did it to repair their roads and so forth. And that hasn't caused inflation. Their prices haven't gone up.
Well, and if the system has worked in past, how come it can't gain any traction now? Is it just this deathlock that the current banking system has on the planet, or is it fear of it will be isolationists if we do this kind of thing? I mean, what keeps quantitative easing happening around the world okay as long as it's for banks, but as soon as it's mentioned for the people, it's turned into something negative? How does that happen? I mean, how can we, what forces are at work to prevent this kind of thing?
Well, according to Ben Bernanke, he doesn't have the option of showering the people with money. It's not in the Federal Reserve Act. So we have to rewrite the legislation. And I think, which should be done, it could be done, it should be done. But I think what keeps the lid on it is the Bank for International Settlements, the Basel Committee, sets these standards, and the standard is you're not supposed to borrow from your own central bank, you're not supposed to print your own money, you're supposed to maintain the value of the currency or the stability of the currency, and allegedly this is done by not getting any new money out there. But in fact, of course, there's new money out there all the time. It's created by banks, and it comes into the economy as loans, and then it's owed back with interest. So it's this horrible debt spiral that we're in now. If you had governments issuing it debt-free to the government, then you could reduce the government's debt, obviously. You could pay off the government's debt, and all you'd be doing is swapping dollars for bonds, which is exactly what the Fed is doing with its quantitative easing. It swaps newly created dollars for bonds that are on the asset side of bank balance sheets, or for mortgage-backed securities, or something else on the asset side of their balance sheets. So it's just an asset swap. They're not really putting more money out there. You could pay off the entire federal debt that way, and it would just be an asset swap.
Yeah, and that, last time you were on, we talked about that. Now I remember that, the $1 trillion coin notion. I mean, it's really, when you think about it, the money itself is just you can label anything. I mean, wampum, is being, if it's determined to have value by government, then it has value. If you have the full faith of that government behind it, it's when you have the middleman in betwixt there, that's where it turns evil. Where you have the Federal Reserve owned by private banks that are playing the middleman between government and people. You end up with basically a nation being hosed and a debt spiral crisis that eventually is going to lead in catastrophe. I mean, is that the music? Yeah, man. Segments go fast when you're on here, Ellen. All right, when we come back, I want to talk about a couple of your latest articles and then maybe get into something a little controversial. We're going to be back with Ellen Brown and more Wide Awake News Radio. Hang tight. All right, guys, welcome back to Wide Awake News Radio. Charlie McGrath, Ellen Brown, and we're having an interesting conversation during the break, and we decided to put it on hold and continue it while we're live on air. And I told Ellen, I said I'm excited because I get to go. I'm going to go to China here pretty quick, and I'm excited to see, how all this production, all this manufacturing has led to this build out in China, and in a lot of cases they're building just for the sake of building. And Ellen, you were making some interesting points about what China's doing with their economy. So
well, apparently they're actually downsizing on growth, and they're aiming for more internal development and not so much exports. And they're increasing their deficit. They're aiming to increase their deficit by 50% so that they can increase Social Security, medical care for the people, low-cost housing. And I mean, the politicians are saying this is what the people want, and they're listening to the people. I mean, it's unbelievable that it's just not like our politicians talk at all. And they can get away with it because their deficit spending is from their own banks, which they own themselves. They have more. Their banking system isn't 100% nationalized, but they have more publicly owned banks than any other country in the world. In fact, that was the third platform of Grillo, that they would nationalize the banks, which is something you have to do if you're going to start issuing credit for the people.
So are you telling me that China has a less debt-laden currency? China, a communist nation, has a less debt-laden and a more fair, more honest currency than we here in the West.
When they were totally communist, they didn't have any debt because they owned the banks and they just printed the money. I mean, the money they issued it wasn't considered like a non-performing loan, like something that they expected to get back. They just issued it and spent it on their own businesses. They owned the businesses, they owned the banks. So it was just kind of an accounting function, like we put so much money into this particular business, and then they could just look and see how much they made back on that. But they didn't have to write it off, and they didn't call it a debt. And then when they joined the World Trade Organization, they had to change their accounting methods. But they didn't. I read this little thing by it was a woman, a Chinese woman, and she said, well, if they want us to call them non-performing loans, we'll call them non-performing loans, but we're not going to change our practices. So they're still just issuing debt to themselves, and they get to keep the interest because they own the banks. So what's the difference? They can carry this debt forever.
Yeah, and why do you feel that the World Trade Organization was so adamant about entering them into this system that we have here? I mean, does it lend credence to the theory that there's a group of bankers who are truly trying to get global financial governance and dominance over this planet? I mean, I know that sounds conspiratorial, but when you look at the systems that work and that benefit the people versus the system that benefit the very few, we certainly seem to have a push towards a system that benefits a few.
Well, the Chinese and the Japanese are more sophisticated than, for example, Libya, or the countries that are not in the Bank for International Settlements were all the rogue countries, Libya and Korea and I don't remember which, but anyway, like there are 5 or 6 of them, and most of them, Iraq, they've been leveled now, or we're at war with them, supposedly for humanitarian reasons,
right.
but there are many other countries that have humanitarian issues, and we don't go to war with them. So it's a bogus excuse. So if you don't want to get on the wrong side of the BIS, then you purport to go along with their rules. But the Chinese are very secretive about their accounting. Nobody really knows what's going on with their money system. And so they're probably still doing the same things they ever were, just funding their own businesses. And they got that idea. C.H. Douglas said that the Japanese and the Chinese had stolen his idea and had perverted it. Instead of using social credit to get money right into the pocket, print the money and get it right to the people through a national dividend, they were printing the money and supporting their industries, and therefore they could outcompete anybody else in the world in the export business.
And that's exactly, this is what happened with Japan when they were entered into the world of industrial revolution, and it's certainly what's happening in China now. I don't know. I mean, if it's the exact same parallel there, but keeping their currency down has always been a game plan of the Chinese, so that they could be known as the world's least expensive exporter, or the place to go source your materials from. One of the reasons that's one of the reasons that I'll be taking a trip over there. A guy from Montana, USA, ends up buying material, 15,000 miles away across the Pacific Ocean. Same materials that could be sourced locally, but because of the system that we have in place, it becomes more expensive for me to buy something 400 miles away than it does 15,000 miles away. And it makes absolutely no sense, yet this is the world we live in. The case of C.H. Douglas and social credit government, do you run the risk of, and I love talking these kind of things because you're an expert and historian on these matters. Do you run the risk of a perversion of this idea, like we saw, like he said, a claim that happened in Japan? We mentioned Germany and Italy in that same statement that these nations were printing money. They were a social credit government, but it wasn't that they were giving the money right to the people, were they? They ended up taking a fascist path, which is collusion between industry and government. So this is the danger of taking a good idea and perverting it.
Well, I think there's a little difference between an industry that is your own industry, as in China, or say in Ecuador, that the government owns the oil company. So they take those oil company profits and they actually use them to back their central bank money. So there's a difference between a collaboration between private industry, which basically has control of the government and milks the government for its own purposes, and a government that's operating for the people. That the tax money goes to services for the people, which owns some corporations and supports their corporations, which with their own government issued money. I think that's actually a good thing. We rail against the Chinese and the Japanese that it's not fair that they're subsidizing their industries and we are not. But it seems to me, why don't we subsidize our industries, or why don't we allow the government to actually operate some businesses that are in the nature of infrastructure, those businesses that everybody shares, that you really don't want competing? I mean, obviously you don't want railroads competing. How many railroad tracks can you lay down? But it's the same for banking itself. Is really an infrastructure thing. We're supporting the banks we the people are supporting the banks, but the banks aren't supporting us. That's
right. And I think the key difference is there you're talking utilities that the government owns, that is above board and can be governed by the people for the people, rather than the system that is obviously in play and in place right now, which is a backhanded control of government by corporate special interest. I mean, they sound like they're the same, collusion between government and special interest, but they're not, because government would be actually, we the people. When I say government in that respect, it's we the people controlling certain aspects of industry that we need, these basic necessity items, like energy and infrastructure, that kind of thing. But when you have a raw so-called capitalist system, which isn't capitalist whatsoever. You have these special interests and corporations controlling government, and it's below board. It's not. It isn't out in the open. And the control and the writing of legislation and the passing of laws that benefit government or to benefit these special interests is sold as a patriotic American thing, but in fact, it's not. Good grief, you're kidding me. That was a long segment. We blew that already. All right, we're going to be back with Ellen Brown tomorrow, Wide Awake News Radio, in just a few minutes, guys. Please hang tight. Welcome back to Wide Awake News Radio. Charlie McGrath joined by Ellen Brown. This last segment of the 6th of March, Wednesday, 2013. Ellen, you and I kept talking during the break, and I completely zoned out where I was gonna take. We're talking about obviously we're talking about social credit government, and guys, trust me, Ellen and I didn't speak today. She sent me this article, and this whole conversation just grew out of what was going on in Italy. Let me focus back. This final segment, let's focus back a little bit to debt. Web of Debt. This is your website, webofdebt.com. This is a book you've written. This is what the world is truly, one of the major problems facing the world right now is debt, how it's created, who gets to pay for it, why are we respecting it, why are we bowing down to it. Nevertheless, we are, and here we are, and focusing back on Italy, the whole European situation. It isn't getting better. It's getting far, far worse, and we're starting to see cracks in society because of it. And you mentioned, this comedian, he doesn't get the majority vote, but he got, I believe, 8 million or some votes like that, enough that he has a voice. How, a historian like you are, how does this play out? I mean, are we just going to go until it collapses and then have the World Trade Organization rule the world? I mean, in your opinion, obviously the things that make sense are out the door. They're not listening to any of this. Are we just going to be led down this path of exploding sovereign debt until we reach a crescendo of pain?
Well, it seems to me that was what was so interesting about the Grillo story. I mean, he was just a comedian. Well, he wasn't. He started out a politician, and then they wouldn't let him speak on TV because he was kind of crude, for one reason. And so he's just giving presentations. He had the biggest blog in Italy. I mean, he's just very humorous, very dynamic, and
be like John Daly. John Daly starting a party.
Yeah, but a little cruder, quite a bit cruder, I guess.
Okay.
And a more negative. I mean, quite hostile, sort of aggressive against the current leadership. And the people got behind him because he's the master of the internet. He totally has abandoned the major media. He's there on the internet. That's where he does his presentations, or he does presentations in person. And he won a huge portion of the vote. So I think that the internet is our salvation. I mean, we have an alternative medium now. We don't have to, the gatekeepers are gone. You don't have to get your article or your interview or whatever past the people that will censor it. There are no censors. It's only, if it's interesting to the people, it'll get out there.
No, yeah, I agree. And I interrupted there. I said yet, because it's very obvious that an attempt to control content and with these copyright laws and these prosecutions of people and infringement of copyright, and I know copyright law is important, but there is an attempt I believe in order to control this exchange of information and ideas, because it is a threat. And if you want to, this gentleman in Italy certainly would be a prime example of how it can work in order to upset the apple cart. And I'm sure that the European Central Bank, they have their eyes on a technocrat they want to be the head of the Italian. Well, wait a minute. Why did I say they have one? They installed a technocrat in Italy. They don't want dissension.
He gets a very small portion of the vote, 3% or something. I don't remember, but the technocrats are out, or they don't have the public support at all. But I did want to add one thing about the social credit and the C.H. Douglas theory. Mm-hmm. The reason we have this whole debt crisis is because there is not enough money in the system for people to purchase their own GDP, for countries to purchase their own GDP. And so the alternatives are either they start competing for foreign markets, but they can't all do that. They're all competing with each other, devaluing their currencies, which is a mutually destructive thing, or people borrow. And so that's why, because they aren't getting paid that money in their incomes, the people who want to purchase the things, the bankers, the investors, the big money, they're not interested in purchasing all these consumer goods. And the people who want the goods don't have the money. So they borrow the money. And that's what starts this whole debt cycle. And even governments borrow the money, which is insane. Governments should have the power to create their own money. So if they did create their own money to give to the people for the things that the people expect out of government, for example, Social Security, Medicare, I would say, are that's the social safety net, plus, of course, all the infrastructure, which would be roads, bridges. I would say banking itself should be infrastructure. That's the way it is in Japan and China. In Japan, rather than socialism is considered control of the means of production, but in Japan, they don't have government control of the means of production. They only have government control of one thing. That's the banking system. If you control the banks, in other words, if you are the source of money, and you set the rules, then you can have a capitalist system that all works cooperatively, and it makes it fair. It makes it work. It's a piece of infrastructure, just like roads and bridges.
But anything other than the current system we have now is going to be obviously portrayed as something else, something less attractive, and how this is sold. And I guess it goes to the point that a lot of the things that you're talking about, like a stipend or a dividend, an annual dividend. I mean, a lot of these things are in principle, or maybe I should say this, in actuality, they are happening because there is over 50% of the population that does receive some kind of, stipend or dividend or money, direct money from government of one form or another, state, local, or federal. There's a huge disconnect what happens in between there, though, because the money that's issued to the people by government, one form or another, isn't money that's created without debt. It isn't money that's created by government. It's created by banks, and it's borrowed. It's borrowed on in that aspect. It's borrowed at every end, borrowed from the government, from the Federal Reserve, and then in a lot of cases issued by the bank directly to the individual that is receiving the benefit. It just goes on to continue the process of establishing more and more and more debt. So, I mean, to cast out the idea altogether, as would happen, I believe, if we went on to a real conservative type radio program or something like that, or talk to a conservative thinker that cast the whole thing out as socialism. Well, guess what? It happens. It's going to happen. We're going to, either we're going to turn into savages and just let people die, go by the wayside and die because there's not enough jobs for everybody to go to, or there's not, they can't afford healthcare or health insurance. We either let them die or we end up taking care of them. But it's hurting a nation as a whole to do it in the process that we are now. Even the people who are suffering are a profit center for these institutions. Agreed?
Agreed. And it's actually just a simple math problem. There is not enough money out there, and the question is how to get it. Right now, people get it by borrowing, and we can see that doesn't work. So allow the government to issue it. If you're worried about the work ethic, there are many different ways you could do it. You could go down to a 4-day work week. You could lower the retirement age to 50 or so, and allow people to have some leisure time when they can actually do what, like in the Middle Ages, the leisure class did. They were the cultured class. They were the ones that did it was their duty to do science and art and music and to carry forth with the culture. I don't know. We have kind of a degenerated system now where people don't seem to put values on those things like they used to. But we could get all that back if we just had a little free time where people could do their own reading and figure out their own values. And
I was going to ask that question on how Douglas would address that, or how would Ellen Brown address what do you do about people that say, well, you're going to have people that just sit around and do nothing? I mean, you would get.
Won't. That's the thing. Let's say you go to a 4-day work week in India, thousands of years ago, the thing was that the first 20 years you were supposed to be a child and you were a ward of the community, and the second 20 years you worked and raised a family, and the third 20 years, I guess they only lived to 60. The men went out with their begging bowls and got to find enlightenment, and that was supposed to be the natural progression of life. And it seems to me we've left out that part. We only let people retire when they're so old and sick that they no longer have the energy to actually do art and culture and find themselves and all those things that are considered quality of life. So so let's say you lowered the retirement age to 40, even have people work from 20 to 40. You've got all this mechanization that is basically the cultural heritage of all of us that should allow us to retire earlier.
But yet we don't. The more technology increases, the more it seems the more frantic things get. The work week expands and extends, and it's this. Well, we had a great call in the last hour, and it was a question. I'll pose it to you. You only get about a minute to answer it. He said, so this all falls apart. This whole system comes crashing down. Do you stand for replacing it with another system that inevitably ends up in debt? Now, he didn't come right out and say capitalism, but do you, what do you support? A system where we all just do things to take care of one another, or a system that, is about going out and earning fantasy dollars so you can, trade your labor for fantasy money so you can have necessity items to survive? And it's a question that does make you think, are we just going to continue on a roller coaster of freedom, tyranny, money that isn't backed by money that isn't issued in debt or banker-controlled money? So, if you could pick a question out of there, I guess it would be inevitably.
That's why I find hope in these smaller countries. That let's say Italy actually did that, they're moving in that direction at least. If somebody does it, Iceland did it, and it's a great model. So if we have enough models, the politicians will do it. Politicians, I think, even the supposedly liberal politicians are inherently conservative. They're not going to do anything to rock the boat unless they have this huge groundswell of support behind them. So it's up to us to understand what's going on and to just keep pushing them. That's what happened in Alberta when they went to the social credit. For 25 years, they had a social credit party in power, and New Zealand, etc. They always have a big movement behind them, a big push from people who, the people themselves meet. And
groundswell, yeah.
Yeah.
I think you got C.H. Douglas calling you right now.
Sorry, I'm in my living room, so you can hear my phone.
That's okay. I don't know if that was kidding. I thought it was funny. Yeah. So it's part of becoming, trying to wake up and realize that everything is molded and shaded to benefit an agenda. So just because the powers that be tell you that a system won't work, or it's negative, or it's anti whatever, anti-American, anti free market capitalism. Well, we need to look through and realize that what's happening right now is an absolute utter perversion of what was originally meant to be a government that issued money, people that issued money. Go ahead.
To have real capitalism, you need an infrastructure. You need a government structure that we don't have. And one item of that would be, I think, banking or money as a public utility, not as a private thing that's where we have private gatekeepers that decide who gets it and
who does, who lives, who dies, who fails, and what they pay, and rack up more and more debt. Ellen Brown, you don't have to believe you or me or anybody else. You just need to look at the society as where we sit right now. Obviously, this model is broken. It doesn't work. It benefits far, far too few, and the masses end up suffering. Ellen Brown, webadebt.com is her website. Thank you very much for coming on tonight. I appreciate it. We'll get you back on again next month.
Thanks, Charlie.
You have a good night. Get that phone. Douglas is calling you. Have a good night. All right, guys, stay tuned for Jeff Rentz because he is coming up next. We'll see you back here tomorrow night. I hope you have a good night. Peace.